Dr. Cebulski is graduate of International Relations and Institute of the Middle and Far East Studies at the Jagiellonian University. He holds a Ph.D. in the field of political studies, author of scientific and popular science articles dealing with the issues of the politics of memory, identity, and genocide studies. Dedicated museum guide. Author of the book Auschwitz After Auschwitz, on the formation of memory around the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Tomasz, please, let's start.
Thank you very much. I promise I won't be that present in the next part of this conference, so it's just for the beginning. The question is whether the history and memory that we talked so much about might actually work in our benefit and may actually work in order to heal us or get us closer. Polish-Israeli relations, which were re-established in late February of 1990, should have reached maturity by now. At the age of 30, you would expect it's time to leave behind the emotional and conflictual period and replace it with a more rational and cooperation-oriented one. But we cannot escape from the fact that in a result of 20th century, there were two separate communities of memory that were created. In the beginnings of the early 1990s, that were marked with emotionally laden conflicts in which two communities of memory, the Polish and Israeli, confronted each other at high speed and clashed of interpretation of a common, contested, at certain levels, history. Interwoven and interdependent for centuries, those two communities were brutally torn apart as a result of nationalistic politics in the 30s and later on the Holocaust. The trauma in the aftermath of war left Polish-Jewish relations mutilated, causing mental and progressive physical separation. The post-war chaos and murder emphasized feelings of betrayal, but this time it was a different betrayal, because this time in the afterwar reality it was a betrayal by my state. Or most painfully, it was sometimes a betrayal by my neighbor. This betrayal was felt even more keenly coming immediately after brutal occupation. The German Nazi genocide, which was the first external to Polish-Jewish shared past, was at the same time one that exploited the pre-war stereotypes. The betrayal came at the time when the victims of this genocide were at the most vulnerable. Many expected to be accepted and suited in their old homeland. Cultural, moral, and identity betrayal added another layer to the post-traumatic stress disorder experienced by the Jews that survived, and pretty immediately they were forced to leave Central Europe and settle in the Middle East or elsewhere in America. This sense of betrayal for many became pretty much the last emotion associated with their own homeland. The post-war rejection of Jews as a minority by the communist state and finally the establishment of the State of Israel caused not only an identity separation between Poles and Jews, but an almost complete physical separation as well. Over time, buried and silenced traumas have produced a love and hate relationship in the Polish and Israeli communities of memory. Love in this equation was more sublime and related to culture and language, whereas hatred is reserved for people and based on the cumulative sense of betrayal that emerged during the mayhem of transition that Poland underwent from being in the grasp of one totalitarian system after another. In communist Poland and Zionist Israel, two separate communities of memory with a partially shared traumatic history took shape. After centuries of sharing common ground and engaging in rich cultural exchange, Polish-Jewish, or this time already Polish-Jewish-Israeli relations were relegated to a political freezer. And here I'm talking about the Iron Curtain. In the academic discourse about the construction of national identity, Poles and Israelis are recognized as being among the nations which are most sensitive to history. They tend to have a strong connection to these countries' pasts and a sophisticated historical awareness as part of their self-identification, and these get processed as fundamental elements of national auto-stereotypes. National identity and self-awareness are very easily dogmatized, losing objective distance from the communities they describe. Nationally constructed identity is defensive in light of criticism and resistant to be corrected. This is because a noticeable change in elements of identity and national self-awareness can lead into a major cognitive dissonance and shake in the very foundations of a given society. Collective memory has become a debated territory where various groups consciously fight to transform the narrative about the past of their nations in order to fit into the current political opinions, thus at the same time influencing the future. And a few words about jump-starting relations once more. 30 years ago, Poland and Israel restarted diplomatic and social relations from actually a very low point of mutual mistrust, each side clinging defensively to its constructed stereotypical image of the other. The political freezer that Poles and Israelis were put into by the Iron Curtain became a deep frost after 1968 anti-Semitic campaign in Poland. It created altogether some 45 years of silence and isolation. Relations were often started on both sides by politicians of the second generation who had no memory of pre-war coexistence or war trauma, but who were equipped instead with an educated yet unnuanced stereotypical image of the other. There was actually a little bit more hatred to begin with than love. At the same time, and against all odds, there was a deep social and political need to re-establish relations, supported by the hope that diplomatic changes in Poland would create a fertile ground for investments, political cooperation, and at the same time confrontation with complicated history. Objectively and rationally, the normalization of mutual relations seemed to be a win-win situation for both partners. But in Polish-Israeli relations, it's often the subjective and emotional that takes center stage. The relations started with conflicts. So the Polish and Israeli communities of memory collided politically and religiously in the early 90s in the most fragile of common historical sites. They collided in Auschwitz. Within the heated debates and inflammatory political and religious rhetoric directed mostly at strengthening of the collective national memories on both sides. There proved to be enough individuals in this very conflictful situation. There was enough of individuals of goodwill who at the same time possessed an understanding of historical facts to create common and trusted institutions like the International Council of State Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau, later or today known as the International Auschwitz Council, which very often became an institution resolving not only historical issues. In the 1990s were filled with constant memory tensions and occasionally erupted into larger conflicts around Auschwitz. At the same time, there was a successful normalization of relations through a policy of small steps promoted by respected individuals like Władysław Bartoszewski or Szewak Weiss. The political milestones of mutual relations in the late 1990s were the Polish Bill on restitution on the Jewish communal property in Poland, the tamping down of conflicts around Auschwitz, and I would also call the signing of a framework agreement on youth exchanges as an important undertaking of late 90s. The year 2000 marked a certain breakthrough in Polish-Israeli relations with the formal visit of President Kwaśniewski to Israel and his words of apology for the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968, along with the promise of reinstating citizenship to all of its victims. In the year 2000, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv was created, so we are also celebrating here 20 years of the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv. The next 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, were marked with a continued growth of social relations and trust, despite occasional political glitches and almost at this level tribal-sounding political interpretations of history for the sake of identity building. The cooperation between Yad Vashem International School for Holocaust Studies with Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum or the Center for Education Development in Poland resulted in thousands of Polish and Israeli teachers and guides, social activists and museum staff taking part in the profound educational seminars in both countries. The often close personal relations and friendships grew out of these encounters, led to a growing number of student exchanges and more frequent visits to Polish schools by Israeli students following Israeli youth delegations to Poland. It is estimated in this time period from 2000 to 2015, around 17,000 of Polish and Israeli students were being given a chance to meet and interact, mostly in Polish schools. Those interactions, in my opinion, are particularly precious as they create an informed experience of the other and a cultural vaccination against political and populist radicalization. Unfortunately, since 2015, the number of such encounters have dropped precipitously due to political obstacles raised by both sides. A few words about the delegations. There was a gradual shift over the last 30 years in the educational content of Israeli youth delegations to Poland, where the dominant Holocaust narrative was more mediated with education about Jewish heritage, Polish history and visiting sites not related to the Holocaust. Also, the numbers of students participating in those programs grew from several hundred in the early 90s into 25,000 in 2012, 32,000 in 2016, and finally 40,000 in 2018. In recent years, the length of those visits was reduced by the Ministry of Education, which resulted in cuts. Mostly the cuts were about the Polish-Israeli youth encounters and non-Holocaust content. Unfortunately, these current political narratives in Israel and Poland that determine the extent to which the trip focus on the Holocaust versus other important things, such as life before World War II, Polish history, and meetings with Polish peers. All too often, education is a scapegoat during skirmishes about politics and identity. Very often, exchange programs rely less on apolitical institutions and more on individual contacts and private teachers or school initiatives. I think there's a need, in order to stabilize those relations a little bit, I think there is a need for respected Polish-Israeli institutions to coordinate those programs. Such an unbiased approach would result in their sustainability regardless of political winds and the personal ambitions of individuals. There is a visible trend in Israel to have those delegations reduced, redirected, or even their voices to terminate those study visits, so that the students can use only the Holocaust educational infrastructure in Israel. This political and a little bit isolationist move may be catalyzed by COVID and will be a major blow to education of facts beyond Holocaust timeline and at the same time a blow to Polish-Jewish relations. The last 30 years in Poland brought a large number of grassroots initiatives which were aimed to commemorate or renovate Jewish heritage sites, but also brought giant museums to be established. Of course, obviously the flagship institution of this kind is the Warsaw-based Museum of History of Polish Jews, Polin. We were welcomed by its director. The museum was initiated in 2013. The museum, with its 8 fact-laden galleries covering 10 centuries of Polish-Jewish relations, greatly extends the spectrum beyond the 5 years of traumatic World War II events and the Holocaust. It offers a well-documented, stereotype-free context of pre-war life, which is essential in understanding the Holocaust. Such bird's-eye view of the complexity of Jewish life in Poland offers also a good fact-based line of defense against simplistic, politically created national dogmas and stereotypes. I wanted to talk also about another very interesting phenomena which develops within the last few years. I've called it neither delegation nor pilgrimage. A very interesting phenomena is taking place in the sphere of tourism. and it's a part of official delegations and largely beyond control of institutions and politicians. It started in 2013 when Israel signed the first open sky agreement with the EU. Distance, costs, and security measures were had been traditionally quoted as major obstacles to the development of Polish-Israeli social relations and youth exchange. The result of the signing of Open Sky Agreement by Israel was an enormous growth of privately organized tourist visits by Israelis to Poland and Poles to Israel. For the first time in our mutual relations, yes, and I really mean that, for the first time in our mutual relations, there was an affordable and massive channel of direct communication and interaction, which was not mediated or framed as a Holocaust delegation to Poland or a Catholic pilgrimage to Israel. In 2012, an Israeli government tourist office opened in Poland to facilitate tourist relations, which over the next several years led to a highly visible billboard campaign promoting Israel in major Polish cities. In 2019, Israel was visited, so only last year, I know that with a perspective of the last 6 months of certain closure, the last year seems like an eternity ago, but only last year, Israel was visited by over 150,000 of Polish tourists, while 255,000 Israelis explored Poland. Of that number, I'm estimating around up to 70,000 of Israelis, 60 to 70,000 of Israelis, took part in various organized and content-controlled Holocaust delegations, which leaves 185 who traveled for leisure, business, or education, or just in passing somewhere else. This growth in travel coincided with the most serious diplomatic spots in the last 30 years over the new politics of memory in Poland. That's also an interesting coincidence, I would say. A special mention should be given to all kinds of attempts of refocusing our attention and building new memory. I believe that there's no better way to work out stereotypes than a personal, unmediated encounter and face-to-face experience with another human being. I can spend hours teaching an academical course about stereotyping and combating stereotypes, and I will not reach the same results than 5 minutes of a face-to-face interaction of two people who have certain stereotypes. Such an opportunity to interact was the September 2019 Polish-Israeli Female Entrepreneurship Forum titled How Women Do Business in Poland and Israel. It was rationally planned, data-driven, and culminated in being one of the largest projects of Polish public diplomacy in Israel. 300 participants, 7 panels, and some 50 speakers created an atmosphere of common focus on the field of contemporary social issues. A few words about a new confrontational politics. Polish-Israeli political relations over the last 5 years have unfortunately been prone to embracing this global trend of populism and let's call it Twitterism in politics. And the conflict has only been emphasized by the rich and still to a large extent unprocessed contested memory of the past. International dialogue seems to have lost its political value as the relations between the two countries are frequently held hostage by the short-term need of internal politics back home. They are held hostage to approaching elections or are just drowned out in the deluge of radical and hateful opinions on social media that inevitably follow every irresponsible and inflammatory political and media comment of either side. How do we break free from this devastating dichotomy of our relations, from trauma, negative memory, post-traumatic stress and guilt, all of which fuel suspicion and stereotypes? How can we wrest from the hands of the politicians a kind of an automated playbook which addresses our basest human instincts and causes a vicious circle of radicalization, only for the sake of increasing their political capital back home? I think public diplomacy is very active and represents an asset much underestimated by both sides, particularly underestimated in media coverage. We live in the time of a certain down of experts. and their influence of daily lives has been reduced, replaced by the fast growth of digital and direct social media communication. It's actually true that an influential YouTuber or blogger can have a much bigger impact on our mutual relations than yet another angry face of a politician, especially within a certain generation. In spite of the significant impact on education, art and business initiatives, of course the political framing still defines and constructs our collective national identity in relation to each other. Politicians, assuming they are representatives of the society, are still the gatekeepers and greatly influence how history is presented and memory is coined, especially in our official international relations. The primacy of domestic policy over international relations will probably always exist. And the Polish-Israeli case is the most common reason for in the Polish-Israeli case, this was the most common reason for the recent diplomatic spats. We shall be able to improve those relations mostly by constant education and raising awareness about the common strategic aims of international policy, business opportunities and common political leverage. The COVID pandemic has created an enormous challenge by suspending the precious direct contacts in the spheres of art, education and tourism. The isolationist global politics of the last 5 years will be only enhanced by the actual political isolation of people, this often refocusing people's attention from the global into the hyperlocal. Digitalization of the already functioning projects and moving social dialogue online seems to be the only option for continued Polish-Israeli dialogue at the present moment. Online education in both countries creates an opportunity for common education projects for students that can be realized in real time and almost at no cost, neither for Israeli or Polish schools. The only obstacle here in this process may be the politicization of education on both ends. The COVID time may be also a good litmus test about the intentions and real potential for the development of Polish-Israeli relations. The online projects we create now, assuming the long-term sustainability, may bring a quadrupled effect when the pandemic subsides. Confronting stereotypes, and that's a certain universal truth, I would say, in all kinds of relations. Confronting stereotypes, facing traumas and developing dialogue needs time, space and rationality. Whereas political or journalistic inflaming of the situation for the sake of conflict-oriented short-term policy happens instantly, engages people emotionally and results in a deep and lasting damage. I'm about to finish, but before I finish I will try to answer the question. So how can the history and memory heal us? Now, luckily, within the last 30 years, Poles and Israelis have worked out many shortcuts that bypass official political channels for the sake of building bridges and understanding. Some of these rely on individuals, and some are more institutionally based. Those which have endured have already worked out their own histories and have a second generation of followers whose work is having a redemptive impact on mutual relations and counterbalancing the negative history of relations with a positive one. We've learned to broaden the spectrum of our mutual interest beyond the relation to memory and the Holocaust. The development of awareness of the richness of Polish Jewish life across the centuries can offer a new common historical space, as well as a new events and heroes, while at the same time providing a new vantage point for a more dialogue-oriented common future. The content of history and memory becoming our focus depends pretty much always on our current needs and philosophical questions we ask at any given time as individuals, but also as a society. Dominic Lecapra persists that in order to understand and transform our thinking, we must be able to think of ourselves as separate from the state. The state is always constructed and anchored in the politics of building collective identity. We need to abstract from that to see the greed of officially constructed and educated subject positions and criticize them. This ability to abstract, or often a need to escape from the formal narrative greed, is already partly true with a certain level of informed Holocaust fatigue shown in the younger generations in Poland and Israel. All in all, the progress is slow and often interrupted by politics, but we've trod a long 30 years path towards better mutual understanding and interaction. If those relations continue to grow and dialogue prevails, this path of working through trauma and contested history may become, and I sincerely believe in that, a model applied to collective knowledge on historical conflict resolution and maybe even genocide prevention. We have an obligation to remember, but also a responsibility not to use our memory against someone else, as such take shallows the sacrifice of life of genocide and Holocaust victims. Making sense of history is about the ability to forgive through cultivation of awareness and creation of memory directed at evading mistakes from the past, but without paralyzing our future. Thank you very much.